was 11 when my mother decided I was no longer hers. That night began like so many others, quiet on the surface, sharp underneath. The house smelled of burnt rice and cheap soap, the kind she always bought in bulk. The ceiling fan clicked unevenly, as if it, too, was tired. I sat at the small kitchen table with my homework spread out, pencil worn down to a stub. I remember thinking that if I finished early, maybe she'd smile at me. Maybe tonight would be different. It wasn't. She came home late, heels loud against the cracked tiles, eyes already hardened by a day I was never allowed to ask about. She looked at the table, at the dishes in the sink, at me. Like I was another mess she didn't want to clean. "Why isn't this done?" she snapped, dropping her bag. I was doing homework. I said softly, pushing my notebook toward her, hoping proof might soften her voice. She didn't look. She never did. Something inside her finally broke, or maybe it had been broken for years and I was just the excuse. Words poured out of her like poison. Lazy, ungrateful, burden. Each one landed heavier than the last. I stood there, hands shaking, trying to understand how a child could deserve such hate. Then she said it. "Pack your things, get out." I laughed at first because it sounded impossible. Mom, her eyes didn't waver. She walked to my room, yanked open the old suitcase from the closet, and threw it onto the bed. Clothes followed shirts, socks, the sweater my aunt had given me. No care, no pause, just finality. I begged. I don't remember what I said, only that my throat burned and my knees hit the floor. I promised to be better. Quieter, invisible. I would clean more, talk less, disappear if she wanted. She didn't listen. By the time she shoved the suitcase into my arms, it felt heavier than my entire body. She dragged me to the door, opened it, and for the first time in my life pushed me outside. The door closed. I stood there, barefoot on cold concrete, staring at the wood grain where my eye level barely reached the handle. I knocked once, then again, then harder. My knuckles hurt, but she never answered. The street was dark, lit only by a flickering street lamp that buzzed like an insect. Somewhere a dog barked. A car passed, slow enough that I thought the driver might stop, might ask why a child was alone at night. They didn't. I walked. I didn't know where I was going. Each step felt unreal, like I was watching someone else's life from far away. I carried my suitcase until my arms ached, then dragged it behind me. My tears came quietly. I didn't want anyone to hear. Eventually, I reached a bus stop and sat down. The metal bench was cold through my thin clothes. I hugged the suitcase like it could keep me safe. I watched the road, half expecting my mother to appear, angry but regretful, calling my name. She never came. That was the moment I understood something no child should ever have to learn. That love could be taken away without warning, that home was not always a place, and that being born to someone didn't mean they would choose you. As the night deepened, fear settled into my bones, but beneath it, something else began to form, small and stubborn. A promise I made to myself, whispered into the dark. If she didn't want me, I would still survive. I didn't know how. I didn't know where I'd sleep. But as I sat there, 11 years old and unwanted, I decided that this would not be the end of my story. It was the beginning. The years after that night blurred together like a road seen through rain. I slept in borrowed rooms, on donated mattresses, on couches that smelled like other people's lives. A distant relative took me in at first, not out of love but obligation. She made it clear I was temporary, a responsibility she hadn't asked for. I learned quickly how to stay small, how to fold myself into corners so I wouldn't be accused of taking up too much space. School became my hiding place. I arrived early and left late, stretching the hours so I wouldn't have to return to a house where silence was safer than conversation. Teachers praised my discipline, my focus, not knowing it was fear that kept me so well behaved. I did my homework under dim lights, sometimes hungry, sometimes exhausted, but always determined. If I was going to be unwanted, I would at least be undeniable. I waited for my mother to reach out. Weeks passed, then months, then years. Each birthday felt like a test she failed. I told myself she needed time, that she was angry but would cool down. Deep down, though, I sensed the truth she never said aloud. She had chosen a life without me. By 15, I had my first job stacking shelves after school. I handed most of my pay over for groceries and bills, keeping just enough for notebooks and bus fare. When other kids talked about their parents' rules and lectures, I stayed quiet. I didn't know how to explain that no one was waiting up for me, that no one cared where I went or when I came home. Anger came later. At first, I had been too busy surviving to feel it, but as I grew older, it crept in quietly, especially on nights when exhaustion made my guard slip. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what I had done wrong at 11 years old to deserve abandonment. I replayed that night over and over, searching for a different ending. Still, I kept going. College felt impossible, but I found a way. Scholarships, part-time work, and endless nights fueled by cheap coffee and stubborn hope. I watched others get help from their families' care packages, tuition checks, warm hugs during holidays. I learned to smile through it, to pretend it didn't hurt. Adulthood arrived without ceremony. I moved into a tiny apartment with thin walls and leaky pipes, but it was mine. For the first time, I had a key to a place no one could throw me out of. I stood in the empty room that first night and cried, not from sadness, but from relief. I built a life slowly, a steady job, a small circle of friends who knew pieces of my story but not all of it. Trust was difficult. Love even more so. I always expected people to leave once they saw the worst parts of me. Yet I showed up every day, working harder than anyone expected, proving myself again and again. I stopped asking why my mother had done it. The question hurt too much, and the answer never came. I convinced myself closure was a luxury for people who were loved properly. Then one afternoon, 21 years after the night she closed the door on me, a letter arrived. It was thick, official, looking with my full name printed neatly across the front. The return address was a law firm. My hands shook as I opened it, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. The letter was brief and formal. It requested my presence regarding a legal matter connected to my mother. I sat down hard on the edge of the couch, the paper trembling between my fingers. I hadn't heard her name spoken aloud in decades. I thought I was past the pain, past the questions. I was wrong. Whatever I had survived, whatever I had built, the past had finally found me. And it wasn't finished with me yet. The law office was colder than I expected, white walls, polished floors, the kind of place where emotions felt out of place. I sat in the waiting room, clutching my bag, watching the second hand of the clock drag itself forward. Every tick sounded like a countdown. I hadn't slept the night before. Memories I thought were buried kept surfacing, uninvited and sharp. When the receptionist finally called my name, my legs felt unsteady as I followed her down the hall. The lawyer stood when I entered, a man in his late 50s with kind but careful eyes. He offered a handshake, then gestured for me to sit. A thick file lay on the desk between us, my name written across the tab. "I'll get straight to the point," he said gently. "This concerns your mother." The word hit me harder than I expected. I nodded, bracing myself. He explained that my mother had recently passed away. There was no dramatic reaction, no tears, just a strange emptiness, like hearing about a stranger who shared my face. I waited for the sadness to come. It didn't. What came instead was tension, tight and coiled, because I knew death wasn't the real reason I was there. The lawyer opened the file. "Your mother left behind legal documents that name you as her sole beneficiary." I blinked, convinced I had misheard. "That's not possible," I said. "She kicked me out. I haven't seen her in 21 years. He nodded, as if he had heard this before. "I'm aware. That's why she left instructions for me to explain everything to you." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were copies of bank statements, property deeds, and trust documents dated from my childhood. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. Everything had been prepared when I was 11, right around the time she forced me out. "There was a trust set up in your name," he said, "substantial. She added to it over the years, property, investments, savings. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe properly. Then why, I whispered, why throw me out if she was planning all this? The lawyer hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Your mother wrote letters. She instructed me to give them to you only if you agreed to hear the full explanation. I nodded numbly. He read aloud from the first letter. My mother's handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, controlled just like her voice. She claimed she feared losing custody of me, due to past decisions she never fully explained. She believed distance would protect the assets she was building, that keeping me out of her life would keep the truth hidden. I listened in disbelief as justification after justification poured out. Fear, pride, control. She said she loved me but didn't know how to be a mother. She said pushing me away was the only way she knew to secure my future. Tears blurred my vision, not because her words healed me, but because they didn't. She could have chosen love, I said hoarsely. She chose secrecy instead. The lawyer nodded slowly. There's more. He revealed that relatives had been paid to keep quiet, that inquiries about me were discouraged, that every attempt I made to disappear had actually been watched from a distance. My successes documented, my struggles noted, all without a single call, letter, or apology. The final blow came with the last document. A clause stated that upon her death, I would inherit everything provided I attended this meeting and heard her explanation in full. I laughed then, a sound edged with pain. So even now, she needed control. The lawyer didn't argue. As I gathered the papers, my emotions twisted together: rage, grief, validation, betrayal. I had spent my life believing I was unwanted. The truth was worse. I had been sacrificed for her comfort, and now the choice was mine. I didn't feel victorious when I walked out of the lawyer's office. I felt hollow, like a room after all the furniture has been removed, echoes bouncing where life once lived. The inheritance papers were tucked under my arm, heavier than any suitcase I had ever carried. For 21 years, I believed I had been abandoned because I wasn't worth keeping. Now I knew the truth. I had been left behind because it was easier. For weeks, I did nothing. I went to work, came home, ate dinner in silence. At night, I reread my mother's letters, hoping the words might soften, might transform into something that felt like love. They never did. Every sentence circled back to her fear, her image, her control. Even in death, she spoke more about herself than about me. Anger tried to take root. I imagined confronting her, shouting everything I'd swallowed as a child. I imagined tearing up the documents, rejecting everything she left behind. But revenge born from rage felt too much like her. I had lived my entire life reacting to the damage she caused. I didn't want my final act to be another reaction. So I chose something else. I accepted the inheritance not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. What was built in my name would finally serve a purpose she never intended. I sold the house she had kept untouched for years, the one she claimed was for my future, but never invited me into. Walking through it was strange. My room had been preserved like a shrine, frozen at 11. I closed the door gently before leaving for the last time. With the money, I built something real. I funded education programs for children who had been abandoned, displaced, or forgotten. I supported shelters that took in kids with nowhere else to go. Every signature I wrote, every project I approved, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I wasn't erasing the past. I was transforming it. People praised my generosity, my strength. They said I was inspiring. I smiled, but I never told them the full story. This wasn't about being admired. It was about making sure no child felt as alone as I had that night under the street lamp. Months later, I visited her grave. I stood there without flowers, without anger. The wind moved softly through the trees, and for the first time, my chest didn't feel tight when I said her name. I didn't thank her. I didn't curse her either. I survived. I said quietly, not because of you, but in spite of you. There was peace in that truth. My revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It didn't destroy anything she loved. It simply removed her power over me. She no longer lived in my thoughts as a wound. She was a chapter, closed, understood, finished. I walked away knowing something she never did. Love is not control, and protection doesn't require abandonment. I had learned those lessons the hard way, but they were mine now. As I stepped back into my life, the one I built from nothing, I realized the greatest victory wasn't the inheritance or the truth or even the closure. It was this: I was no longer the 11-year-old girl begging at a locked door. I was the woman who chose what came next.